The Book of Job, The 5 Stages of Grief in Job, by James Hatton. Where was God when? Is a question that is often asked at a time of tragedy. At times it is asked with a longing to understand. At times it is asked out of anger. When struggling to come up with an answer to such a question, some might turn to the story of Job, found in the Bible. Job was a wealthy man, a leader in his community with 10 children, and renowned for his wisdom and philanthropy. The Bible tells us that God's evaluation of him was that he was blameless and upright, a man who feared God and turned away from evil. But Job's world was turned upside down overnight when he lost all of his possessions, his children, and his reputation. Unknown to Job, there had been a confrontation in heaven between God and Satan. As God praised Job, Satan questioned Job's motives, suggesting that he didn't fear God for nothing. Take away his wealth and his health, Satan conjectured, and Job would curse God rather than fear him. In reality, this wasn't so much a slam on Job as it was a slam on God himself. Satan was suggesting that God wasn't worthy to be feared and can only buy men's respect. God gave Satan permission to prove his accusation, but whatever he did, he wasn't to take Job's life. So it was Satan who was behind the Sabean and Chaldean raids that took Job's herds. It was Satan who was behind the fire from heaven that burned up Job's crops. It was Satan who was behind the fierce winds that destroyed Job's oldest son's house and killed all 10 of his children. Expecting Job to curse God and die, as his wife suggested, we can only imagine Satan's reaction when Job replied, "The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." If the story had ended there, I don't know if many of us would have been able to relate. However, the story continues, with Job visited by 3 old friends who come to comfort him. When they find him, they are shocked and hardly recognize him. Covered in sores from head to toe, he is outside the city, sitting among the ashes, the local dump where garbage is burned. To have suddenly come upon hard times like Job had was construed to be a sign of the judgment of God for some secret willful sin. His friends sit for 7 days without saying a word until Job finally breaks the silence. There are several characteristics of grief that have been observed, including denial, depression, bargaining, anger, and final acceptance. Reading the story of Job, we can see all of these traits. Job's first reaction could be seen almost as denial. It was the reaction of one who allowed the truth about God as he knew it to take over in his awful situation. The amazing thing was what he had said, and it was true. As we follow his story, remembering that the context is Satan's attempt to show that God is not worthy to be feared, we see Job experience the whole range of emotions characteristic with grief, and yet, in the end, come to the same conclusion. God is worthy to be feared. Job breaks his silence in the depths of despair. He has 3 wishes. He wished he'd never been born. He wished he died at childbirth. He wished he could die right now. It may have been a month since he had lost everything, and since afflicted with this terrible skin disease. No one can say for certain exactly what skin disease he was suffering from. Suffice it to say, it was sufficient to take away his sleep, his appetite, and his will to live. Job had plunged into depression. Yet, in each stage of his grief, we can see a glimpse of his inner faith that brought God's admiration. Part of the reason he wanted to die was that he didn't want to curse God. Job continues in his depression through most of the book, but the comfort of his 3 friends brings out other reactions. True to the philosophy of the day, his 3 friends tell him that he is obviously under the hand of God's judgment, and his best option would be to confess his sin and get right with God and wait for the blessing to return. That's how it worked. God blessed the righteous and punished the wicked. This was Job's understanding too, at least up until the point, but his thinking had been thrown into disarray. He wasn't aware that he had done anything to deserve such an outpouring of God's wrath. So we see Job bargaining. He asks his friends to point out what he has done wrong, and he would be glad to confess it and get out from under his terrible. His friends didn't know, but as time went on they surmised what he had done, accusing him of placing his trust in riches instead of God, and of being selfish. Job turns from his friends to God and pleads with him to tell him what he had done wrong. But the heavens are as brass. God doesn't answer. From our perspective, we know why God didn't answer. Job hadn't done anything wrong to deserve this. God was allowing his servant Job answer Satan's accusation that God was not worthy to be feared, so he couldn't explain everything. Job and his friends go round and round until we see Job becoming angry with God. Job and his friends believe that God blessed the righteous and punished the wicked. Job was unaware of any wickedness on his part, and yet here he was, being punished by God. God was unjust. In fact, Job was so convinced that he was right, he asked God for his day in court. Had he been able to find a judge who could hear his case, he knew that he would acquit Job and find Job guilty of injustice. Job was mad, but still God was silent. Finally, God speaks. When he speaks, however, he doesn't come explaining himself to Job. Instead, he plies Job with questions, 70 questions in fact. He asked him about the creation of the world. Surely he knew because he was there, wasn't he? He asked him about the stars. Surely he knew their names, wouldn't he? He asked him about the weather, the animals, not for information, but to help Job with perspective. Job responds not with accusations of injustice, but he said, "I place my hand over my mouth." That wasn't good enough. God continues his interrogation and has Job consider two great beasts that were feared by men and which could not be tamed by them. Men give these beasts a wide berth, and yet Job was attacking their maker. Job began to see. God created and sustained all things, but Job didn't know how. He just trusted God to get on with his job. Could he not trust him now, even though his world was shattered? Job hadn't suffered because he had sinned, but he had sinned because he had suffered. And then he repented. He decided that God was worthy to be feared. Job repented with no certain knowledge that his situation was going to change. He didn't fear God because he knew that God was going to restore his fortune and give him another family. Satan had taken away everything. He had done everything he could to wring out Job a curse, but he had failed. There among the ashes, covered in sores, Job trusted God simply because God was worthy to be feared.